Hey everyone, this is Dr. Keaton, and I wanted to quickly welcome you all to Intro to Criminal Justice this semester. And this is going to be a PowerPoint presentation that will cover some key concepts and ideas in the chapter one of the textbook. This is not going to be an in-depth overview of the chapter as a whole. Rather, I'm going to talk about, uh, a handful of key points that I feel like deserve more explanation or discussion to put it in better context of the goal of the overall class, what we're trying to accomplish here. Um, I plan to do this for every chapter, and again, with I would say with very few exceptions, if any, these will not be in-depth overviews of the entire chapter. So you will need to read your text, and then this is kind of intended to supplement it and place it in better context. So um, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of the U.S. criminal justice system. And in saying that, I have two points I want to make. The first one is a more simple and shorter one that I specified. This is about the United States criminal justice system. So the way we handle crime and uh, social harm here in the United States through our criminal justice system is going to be fairly unique, and it would not really be proper to generalize the way we do things here with the way things are done in other countries. If you look at, say, the police, courts, the correctional systems in other countries, and compare them to us, you are going to probably see some similarities, but there are going to be a lot of differences. And the differences are significant enough that it wouldn't be appropriate to take a lot of the things that we're talking about in here and then assume that that's the way it is everywhere. Okay. So from here on out, just assume when we say criminal justice system, we're talking about the United States. And on that point, real quick, it is challenging enough to generalize across the United States because things are different from one place to another, from one state to the next, which is something we'll get into later. But anyhow, the other key point here is about the idea of talking about criminal justice in our country as being a system. And I asked the question when I opened this class, what is a system? Because we call it a system and it's like, oh yeah, it's a system. But probably most people haven't really put much thought into what that means and whether or not it accurately describes what we have going on in our society. And so for most people, I think when they think or hear the word system, they think about a carefully constructed um, set of policies and practices and organizations and people who work together cooperatively to uh, carry some task or set of tasks through to a predicted outcome. So you think like a factory assembly line or a bureaucratic process in an organization, like getting a job. The system is set up to apply online. It goes to the HR person. The HR person filters through their applications. They have a set process to follow. They call you for an interview, yada, yada, yada. And then if you get the job at the end of it, they offer you the job, you go into your hire paperwork training, right? That's a system. In criminal justice, it's not really that way. Rather, I would encourage you to think of it more as a network or maybe a framework, but more of a network. And it's a complex network made up of organizations, institutions, and people working together or working to address social harm and social conflict, which includes crime. And it's important to note that I don't really argue that they are necessarily working collectively or working together on this process. And I'll talk about that more here in a second. And so when you look at all of these organizations and institutions that are doing work within the space related to criminal justice, um, they're coming from different levels of society. For instance, you're going to have local, state, and federal governments. This is probably the most obvious to you. Um, People think about the police department, they think about the court system, the courthouse, and trials, and they think about the federal government, the FBI, and the DEA, or whatever. And um, those organizations or entities most definitely have a huge part to play in how criminal justice work is carried out in our society. But in addition to these government agencies, you're going to have public and private entities involved in the process. So public entities like they could be neighborhood watch groups, they can be nonprofit organizations that are working with crime victims or working on crime policy. Um, you may have advocacy groups that would be arguing for some criminal justice reform or whatever. And you'll have private entities, and this is actually a growing sector of the criminal justice quote unquote system in the United States, which is going to include things like private security, and not just like your mall security guards or the ones you see sitting at guard shacks and stuff like that at factories, but private security that work with corporations and companies to protect major property and financial resources. This is going to include fraud investigators for banks and financial institutions. It's going to include major security firms that do cybersecurity or private security services for businesses and residences and homes and schools and all of that stuff. All of these private organizations, businesses, for-profit entities are having a role to play in criminal justice in society. And then you have individuals. You're going to have individual crime victims. You may have friends or family of crime victims. Or you may have what are called moral or social entrepreneurs, who are individuals who kind of take on the responsibility of advocating for a particular crime-related or criminal justice-related issue. And we'll talk about those people a little bit more later on. Excuse me. But these individuals can occasionally promote pretty significant shifts in how criminal justice is pursued, how it's carried out in our society. Other people who might be considered here could be media and news reporters, journalists, social media pundits, people who talk about criminal justice. It could be, sometimes you'll have people, you've probably seen the videos of the people who will go out in public and videotape and then wait for people to confront them about what they're doing. Those individuals are working to promote some change in the criminal justice process or the system itself. So all that to say that when you think about criminal justice in our society, I challenge you to really start thinking about it much more broadly and recognize that the way our criminal justice quote unquote system works in the United States is really not all that systematic at all. And the reason that that's the case is because these people and institutions and organizations often have competing goals and conflicting goals and interests. They're all maybe working towards similar kinds of things. Like, I think it'd be kind of hard to argue that anybody working within the criminal justice sphere in some capacity is not hoping to try and reduce harm to people. But I promise you there's going to be extraordinarily significant disagreement on how that should be done or what that should look like. And as a result, this conflict is going to inherently result in inefficiency and ineffective outcomes. And in many cases, it's fairly easy to argue that many of the outcomes are not just ineffective, but they're even more harmful than what we started out with. But we'll get into that later on. And so when we talk about the criminal justice system this semester, and if you stay in criminal justice coursework, you'll talk about it throughout your time here, and hopefully beyond, that a lot of what we're dealing with in our society with regards to crime and criminal justice uh, is the product of this conflict and inefficiency, but also a catalyst for all of this inefficiency and ineffectiveness in the system itself. So hopefully that made some sense. It makes sense in my brain. But anyway, the next concept I want to talk about is what justice is. So we hear about justice. We're talking about criminal justice. What does that mean? What do we mean when we say justice? And I do this regularly, and there are some common themes, but I don't, by and large, in any class of people, classroom full of students, let's say there's 40 of you all in this class, I think it's around 40. If I asked you to do this, I would probably get 40 completely different answers that may have some commonalities, but a lot of variation and a lot of lacking is specificity and detail. But anyway, so there are multiple ways to conceptualize or define what justice is, and some of these you may have heard about. Others maybe not, but you will at some point through your this class and your other coursework. And I'm not going to go into these super in depth for the most part, except I will talk about the first two: retributive justice, procedural justice, distributive justice, social justice, restorative justice, transformative justice. You'll have racial justice, gender justice, all kinds of stuff. All of these are different ways of talking about how we could achieve, how different people and groups argue that we can achieve a more equitable, fair society and reduce social harm and conflict, okay? We may not agree on how to get there or what that should look like, but if you sit down with anybody and talk about what they want out of a perspective of justice, it's some positive outcome, okay? But for our purposes here, it's the first two that I'm going to focus on. And that is going to be retributive justice and procedural justice, because those two perspectives are the lenses through which you can look at the American criminal justice system and find your greatest perspective, or that's where you'll get your greatest understanding. Or I don't think I stated that well. If you want to understand the U.S. criminal justice system, why it functions the way it does, why it's structured the way it is, why the public perceives its effectiveness or ineffectiveness in certain ways, those are the two perspectives that tend to give you the most insight. Okay, and hopefully that makes sense. Or if it doesn't now, hopefully it will after I get done here. So before I get into the details here that I want to talk about, I do want to bring this case up as kind of a point or a framework or a frame of reference to work with. I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to go back and look at the video clip I've posted in Canvas about this. It's a news clip from the 1990s talking about this case to kind of put this in better context. But some of you all may be aware of this, even if not in detail. It was a pretty major social phenomenon at the time, for lack of a better word, where OJ Simpson, who was a well-known professional football player and an actor in the 70s, 80s, 1990s, was accused of committing murder, accused of stabbing his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ronald Goldman to death outside of her condominium in Los Angeles in 1994. It didn't take long for the police to kind of focus in on OJ Simpson as the suspect, because there had been a history of domestic violence, a well-documented history of domestic violence toward Nicole Simpson from the hands of OJ Simpson and he was ultimately identified as the perpetrator, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. When the police went to arrest him, there was this low-speed vehicle pursuit in Los Angeles. OJ was riding in the back of this white Ford Bronco. This is kind of like almost like a meme of sorts for the time. He was ultimately arrested, charged with murder. There was a very high-profile criminal trial. It was followed incredibly closely by the news. It was almost like a media frenzy on this trial, and it was talked about nightly by news reporters and the TV shows, the crime TV shows that talk about current events, things like that. The outcome of this trial, which is interesting in and of itself, OJ Simpson was found not guilty of murder. He was enthusiastic, he was excited, his family was there, they were rejoicing, and the families of the victims were left completely distraught and defeated because the evidence tended to fairly overwhelmingly indicate that OJ Simpson did in fact kill their loved ones and had been found not guilty of the crime itself. So on one side you have OJ Simpson, who believes that justice was served, and on the other side you have the victims' families and many members of the public who believe that justice was not served. So was justice served in this case? And this is kind of a thought experiment because we talk about justice, we talk about how the criminal justice system is supposed to get us justice, but we don't have a clear understanding of, for most people, what we mean by saying that. And so, was justice served here? Well, it depends. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on your perspective. So again, with that case in mind, let's talk about these two competing perspectives of justice: retributive justice and procedural justice. Because again, as I said before, if you want to understand our system and how we understand our system, these are the two lenses, so to speak, to look through to kind of get a feel for what's going on here. Retributive justice is the idea that justice is found through accountability and punishment in response to criminal acts. A person commits a crime. They are apprehended, they are prosecuted, they're convicted, and they are punished for what they did. And then that punishment then is the justice because they've been held accountable. Retribution has been, handed over. This is reflected in concepts that you may have heard like lex talionis or just deserts, which we'll talk about later, or eye for an eye. This idea that you do wrong, you deserve wrong in response to that. We contrast that with procedural justice, which is a perspective that emphasizes the use of a fair and impartial process in adjudicating accusations of wrongdoing. You are accused of a crime, and you are due a set of procedural steps and safeguards that should be applied to your case. And through that process itself, if you're found guilty, then you're punished. If you're found not guilty, then you're freed. And that's where justice is found under procedural justice. The outcome is not as important as the process itself. And this is reflected in concepts like, due process, or innocent until proven guilty, or we have blind justice in our society. It's the idea that every individual person who is accused of a crime has certain due process rights and practices and procedures that must be followed. And that through that process, that's where justice happens. And if at the end of that process, the person happens to be found guilty and punished, so all the better. If not, then it should be assumed that they were not guilty and that justice was served in that case. The problem, or the for lack of a better word, the problem we run into is these two competing perspectives result in a tension between how people see the goals and process, what the goals of the criminal justice process should be, how it should be conducted, what kinds of laws are made and how they're enforced, how agencies function, and how the public views the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. So going back to the OJ Simpson case, looking at those two groups of people, you have OJ Simpson and his family who believe justice was served because he was found not guilty, and they're celebrating. And then you have the families of the victims who believe justice wasn't served because the evidence tended to demonstrate that Simpson was guilty of the crime, and he was later held accountable in civil court. And by most accounts, most people tend to argue that, yeah, he probably did do it, but he was found not guilty. And so to them, justice wasn't served, and they even kind of brought that up in the news clip. So how do you define justice? Okay. And these two perspectives get into that. The retributive perspective would be the one more of the victims' families or many members of the public. That, well, he did it, he should have been prosecuted, or he should have been convicted and punished for that. And from the procedural justice perspective, there was justice there. Just because you don't like the outcome doesn't mean there wasn't justice. But that doesn't do a whole lot for the victims' families when the person they believe committed a crime against their loved ones walks out of the courtroom a free person. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And you'll see this kind of competing tension through the system. And again, and we're going to come back to this quite a bit throughout the semester, but it has to do with looking at justice as the product or the outcome of the process versus the process itself. Okay? And tied to that, and then the chapter gets into this as well, is this idea of the two models of the criminal process. And there was a legal researcher named Herbert Packer, who conceptualized this in 1964. And essentially he said that if you look at the United States criminal justice system, particularly the court system was what he was looking at, but I extend this dichotomy to all aspects of the criminal justice system, that you really have competing perspectives here. And one perspective is the due process approach or the due process model, and the other is crime control. And these are he conceived them as on a continuum, or like two ends of a spectrum. On one end, you have absolute due process, and on the other end, you have absolute crime control, meaning that on the due process side, that we go over and beyond and above and beyond and over the top, protecting the accused rights and due process rights, and assure that every potential legal safeguard or misstep is addressed and dealt with, and so on and so forth. And on the other end of it, the crime control model says, no, these people are guilty. We need to process their cases efficiently and get to the conviction at the end so that we can administer punishment. And Packer described these two approaches this way. He argued that due process was obstacle course justice, that there are these procedural safeguards and processes in place that are intended to slow the process down, to help protect the rights of the accused, and ideally assure that people who are wrongly accused of crimes have every opportunity to prove their innocence in court. And the crime control side is more of an assembly line justice approach, where, we know if the police arrested you, then there's an extraordinary high likelihood that you did in fact commit the crime. And so we don't need to waste time going through all these due process things. Let's process this case quickly and effectively, get the conviction and get the punishment. Okay. And so under due process, you're innocent until proven guilty, where under crime control, it's assumed you're guilty. Again, the police wouldn't have gotten out with you and arrested you if you hadn't been doing something wrong, okay? And again, in due process, the emphasis is on due process. Due process rights, Miranda, your pretrial hearings, your suppression hearings, your right to an attorney, and this, that, and the other thing, all those little things. Whereas the criminal or the crime control process is worried about bypassing that as much as possible or as quickly as possible for the purpose of having an efficient process to get you to move through the system. And again, justice is determined by the process itself under due process, whereas crime control focuses on the outcome. The outcome is the guilty plea or the guilty verdict and the punishment. And then this reflects the ideas of procedural justice and retributive justice. The due process model is another way of talking about procedural justice. That through the process and those procedures, they have to be applied properly to assure that justice is done and that the innocent are not wrongly convicted and punished for things that they did not do. Whereas crime control focuses on that outcome, getting retribution, holding people accountable as quickly and efficiently as possible. Okay? And so this model or these perspectives will ultimately guide our examination of the criminal justice system for the remainder of the class. And I think that probably, I hope that if you reflect on even some of your thoughts thinking about like OJ Simpson or the case or other things that you may have already thought about or are familiar with the criminal justice process, that there kind of this tension back and forth between, well, I mean, the person probably did do it and they seem to be a dirtbag and they've done all this crap before in the past and it seems like they were pretty caught dead to rights and why are we giving them all of this extra stuff, or why was their case dismissed because the police did this or didn't do that when it's obvious they did it. So that in and of itself is a reflection of this tension back and forth between, well, we understand that at least I hope you think this way, that the Constitution and constitutional rights and due process rights are important and they should be applied and used, but it sucks when guilty people get away with what they did because the police screwed up, or, right? That's that tension at work. And so that's kind of the end of this chapter or this presentation here. But the key points here, again, the criminal justice system is really a complex network of organizations, entities, individuals with conflicting goals and values and how best to do the work of criminal justice. There are competing definitions of what justice is or should look like and how to achieve it. The U.S. criminal justice system can be best understood by applying retributive and procedural justice concepts to how the system works, and we're going to get into this a lot more as we move through. And then Packer kind of put this in a different approach by arguing that the criminal justice system has these two competing philosophies of due process and crime control, and that if you want to understand the criminal justice system better, you have to kind of look at it using those two perspectives, which I then argue reflect the ideas of retributive and procedural justice.